Welcome to Ghostly Tales channel. Are you looking for creepy, mysterious, and dramatic stories? You have come to the right place. Here, we will bring you unforgettable experiences with ghost stories, terrifying urban legends and mysteries that you have never dared to explore. Come with us into the world of mysteries, where every sound can make your heart beat faster. Please listen, everyone. Revenge and Gratitude Tam, a village around 1930 to 1940, like many other villages, lived in the peasant landlord class. People were very hungry and miserable all year round, working hard, working their faces to the ground and their backs to the sky without any rest. Those who were lucky enough to still have fields were less miserable and less hungry. But those who did not have fields were very miserable. Tao and Min's family had rented land from Mr. Fu for decades now. Since the time of Tao's biological father, they had rented land from Mr. Fu's father and son, the richest landlord in Ha village. The biological parents struggled to raise 4 children until they grew up and went to the afterlife. The first 3 children of the ancestors were all girls who married men from other places. And he was the youngest and also the eldest, staying in this village. As the eldest, he had the responsibility of taking care of the graves and burning incense for the ancestors. He was 25 years old when he met Ms. Min. After a short time of getting to know each other, they were of one mind. He saved up money to buy a pig and asked her to marry him. From then on, she followed him home. After 6 or 7 years of living together, they gave birth to 3 children. The 2 oldest were girls and the youngest was a son. The family was poor, and they had children so quickly that the couple had to work hard to make ends meet. It was rare to have a bowl of rice, and all they had was sweet potato leaves, boiled corn, and boiled potatoes. The skinny, dark children clung to their mother and cried out, "Mom, I'm hungry, Mom." She looked at her young children and said, Yes, wait for Mom a bit. The potatoes are cooked, wait." Gao, the eldest girl, was now 5 years old. She stood next to her mother and grabbed. No, afraid that No would jump into the pot of hot potatoes. Siyu hugged his mother's breast and tried to squeeze out a little milk. One hand holding the child, the other hand grabbing some straw to use as a mat, she lowered the pot of hot potatoes to the ground. Gao took the torn tray next to her to help her pick up some hot potatoes. No was so hungry, as soon as she saw the potatoes on the tray, she immediately jumped in and grabbed a small potato. Her soft hands touched the hot object. She let go of her hand and hugged her arm, crying, her eyes and nose running. Gao scolded her. "No is so stupid. Who told you to pick up the hot potatoes? Wait until the potatoes cool down and then eat." No cried a little more to stop crying. She stood up to play with the puppies, her eyes looking out into the yard waiting for the teacher to come home. While the pot of potatoes was still hot, Ms. Min put it on the stove and boiled some sweet potato leaves. When the vegetables were cooked, she took out the chipped fish and put it on a plate. From the 2 jars in the corner of the house, she took out a bowl of salted eggplant and a bowl of soy sauce. Carefully, the children waited for the teacher to come home to eat. A moment later, Tao came home shirtless, carrying a hoe. The 2 children ran out to the yard to welcome the teacher. Gao went to get a ladle of cool water for her teacher. Thin took the ladle of well water from the child's hand and drank it all. Before they could rest, No babbled, "Teacher, eat." "Eat, teacher." The little girl must be very hungry. She just wanted the teacher to come home, so she could have lunch. Tao smiled. "If you're hungry, tell your mom to feed you first. You don't need to wait for the teacher." No shook his head. "No, wait for the teacher to eat." Chi Min had just put the baby to sleep and walked out of the house. "Is the teacher back? Come in and eat, or you'll be hungry." "Yes, has Mom put the baby down yet? When it's done, let's eat." The family of 4 sat in the thatched roof right on the porch. In front of them was a tray of sweet potatoes. Chi Min brought out 4 bowls, all chipped, and a few pairs of chopsticks, and gave them to the baby and the 2 children. She picked up a sweet potato for each person. Tao took it and picked up some more vegetables to dip in soy sauce, and made a few pieces of eggplant to help it go down. That simple and poor meal was filled with laughter. After eating, the 2 girls went to bed, lying on the cot holding a palm leaf fan, fanning the child, the sound of Ms. Min singing a lullaby to her child. "Ah, too." The stork went out to eat at night, landed on a soft branch, and fell upside down into the pond. "Oh, please pull me in. I have a good heart, please stir the bamboo shoots. If you stir, stir in clear water. Don't stir in muddy water. Oh, it hurts the little stork's heart. Oh. When the child fell asleep, Ms. Min gently sat up, afraid of waking the children, sat up and tied her hair up, then went to the pond to wash and dry the clothes on a pole. Then she went out to scoop water from the pond to water the rows of sweet potatoes, the row of Malabar spinach. After watering, sat down and carefully caught worms on the leaves because this row of sweet potatoes was the family's main food. After taking a nap for a few moments, Mr. Tao sat up and stretched to relieve his fatigue, went to the well to scoop a bucket of water to drink, then carried his hoe to the field. Every day, he went from dawn to dusk, hoping to earn some rice at the end of the season for his wife and children to eat. Sister Mean stayed home to take care of the children, clean the yard, and tend to the vegetable beds, then sat down to split bamboo and weave some baskets and trays to take to the market to sell. Early in the afternoon, Sister Mean told her son Gao to watch his two younger siblings carefully so they wouldn't fall. After giving her instructions, she took the basket and went to the fields and ponds to catch crabs and snails to cook for dinner. After a long time, the basket was full of crabs and she planned to go home and cook dinner. When she got home, the three children were playing with the puppies. When they saw their mother, they all rushed out. She poured the crabs into a clay pot, added a little water, and added a little salt to make the crabs release the dirt. She left the crabs there and took the two children to the yard and the well to bathe the children. After bathing the children, she started pounding the crabs to make soup. It was getting dark when Brother Tao came home, turned on the oil lamp, and the whole family sat together to eat dinner. A peaceful family day passed like that. The next morning, the sun had not yet risen. Ms. Mean picked some sweet potato leaves and Malabar spinach, and took 6 new baskets she had woven yesterday afternoon, put them on a carrying pole, and brought them to the market to sell. The market opens at around 6 a.m. mainly for poor people who have agricultural products such as vegetables, crabs, and snails, and sell them to families with money to buy. When almost all the vegetables and baskets were sold from afar, Ms. Lu, Mr. Fu's wife, went to the market, saw her sister and bowed her head and said, "Hello, ma'am. Today, ma'am, please buy some for me." Ms. Lu stood from above and looked down at where Mean was sitting. She said, "You're Mean's mother. How about selling these baskets? I bought them for 2 cents. Ms. Mean looked up. "Yes, ma'am. Please pay me 3 cents. Ms. Lu said, "I'll pay 2 cents. If you like, then sell them." "Yes, ma'am, 2 cents is fine." Here, Miss Lu bent down to hold the basket. Miss Lu threw the money on the ground. At that moment, Miss Lu looked at Miss Mean's 2 breasts, which were full and dripping milk onto her shirt. She asked, "You mother, do you have a lot of milk? How long have you been giving birth?" Mean replied, "Miss, it's been more than a year." "How many litters have you given birth to? Your milk is so good. And I need a nanny. Come with me to be a nanny. Come over this afternoon." Miss Mean said, "I've given birth to my 3rd child. Yes, I'll go over this afternoon." Miss Lu said yes and turned around and walked away. Miss Mean took the money and put it in her pocket, happily going home. After finishing cooking lunch, her teacher came back and discussed with her teacher that Miss Lu was hiring a nanny. Aunt Tao thought it was time to say, "Let's go over and see how it goes. If it works, we'll go. But be careful with what you say, or else you might offend your teacher and aunt, and you'll be dead." Sister Mean smiled gently. "Teacher, just be calm. I don't dare to say anything rude, but teacher, don't you think it's strange?" Brother Tao didn't answer. He lit the pipe, took a puff of smoke, and then said, "How strange. I see that Miss Lu at Mr. Fu's house doesn't have any children that need a nanny." He replied, "She's annoying. If people need her, then we should go." "Well, I'm going to the field. It's almost harvest time. I have to keep an eye on her. If something is stolen, all my work will be in vain." "Yes, teacher, go. I'll go to Mr. Fu's house now." Brother Tao didn't say anything, picked up the hoe and left. Sister Fed see you, put him to sleep, and told Gao to look after him while she went to work and came back in the afternoon. Gao said yes and slept soundly. Mean went out to the yard, crumpled a face towel, wiped her face properly, picked up the hat, and went to Mr. Fu's house. Sister stood outside the gate, looked in, and called out, "I'll report to you too. Are you home?" Inside the house, a dog barked loudly. A servant ran out to look. "Hey, what's the matter? Are you home?" She craned her neck to ask to come in, because Miss Lu had an appointment this morning. The servant opened the gate for her to come in. When she entered the yard, the dogs in the house barked loudly. She was scared and hid to one side, sitting at the edge of the yard telling the other servant, "Please tell her to let me in." The other servant agreed, and ran into the inner house to invite Miss Lu out. About an hour later, Miss Lu emerged from the inner house, carrying a small puppy in her arms. The servant behind her carried a basket with 8 puppies in it. She saw her older sister bowing, but she didn't reply and went to sit on the sofa. The servant put down the basket of puppies, poured some water, and stood fanning herself. Miss Lu picked up her teacup, blew on it a few times, took a few sips, and then said to the servant, "Get me 2 small bowls and give them to that mother." The servant said yes, ran down to the kitchen, and gave the 2 small bowls to Miss Mean. She held the 2 bowls, still confused and not understanding. At that time, Ms. Lu sat in the house and said, "My dog gave birth to 9 puppies. It has too little milk to feed the puppies. I hired you to be the wet nurse to feed these puppies until they know how to eat rice. Every day you come here, twice morning and evening, and milk 2 bowls full of milk for me. Every day, I will pay you 5 cents. Ms. Mean was stunned. Who would ever feed a dog human milk as a wet nurse? "Miss, 5 cents is too cheap. The milk is very good, miss." Ms. Mean had not finished her sentence when Ms. Lean scolded her. "You have given birth to your 3rd litter, and your milk is not even as good as my dog's milk. I feed it more chicken and beef than you have eaten in your entire life. I will only pay you 5 cents. If you can do it, then do it. If not, I will find someone else. If you accept, then quickly milk the bowls for me, or the puppies will be hungry." Mean did not dare to think about it and immediately agreed. Then I took off the hat on my head, covered my body, looked around and saw no one. Then I pulled out my breast, held the bowl with one hand, and squeezed the milk into the bowl. The drops of pure white milk flowed into the bowl, and in no time, the bowl was full. I handed the bowl of milk to the maid, who held it with both hands and carefully presented it to Miss Lu. She looked at the bowl of milk and nodded. The maid took the bowl of milk and put it in the basket for the puppies to try. The puppies smelled the milk and immediately rushed to lick the milk. Miss Lean sat watching the puppies eat the milk with a satisfied look. Miss Mean sat in the middle of the sunny yard, her eyes looking in while Miss Lu agreed and waved her hand to signal for another bowl. She sat down again, squeezed milk into the small bowl until it was full, and gave it to the maid to bring in. The puppies finished eating 2 full bowls of milk and seemed full, so they rolled over and fell asleep. Miss Lu took out 2.5 cents from her person and threw it into the yard, saying, "Here, I'll give you 2.5 cents for today's wages. Come back tomorrow, then I'll pretend to be that day." She finished speaking and carried the puppies into the house. Ms. Mean bowed to her, picked up the money, put it in her pocket, put on her hat, and left. Halfway there, she felt her nipples aching a bit, probably not used to expressing milk by hand. With money in her pocket, she bought a bucket of rice to cook for her family. It had been a long time since she had eaten a grain of rice. If she could eat rice today, the children would be very happy. She thought of her children's smiles. No matter how hard it was, she had to try. When she got home, the sky was turning to afternoon. The children heard the sound of her mother coming home and hurriedly ran out to hug her. Little Siyu was being held by his sister and was still crying. His eyes and nose were all over the place. Gao said, "Little Siyu is so hungry, I don't know what to do. Let him suckle." She gave the rice to her child and said, "Today you have rice. Go to the kitchen and let me cook rice." Hearing that there was rice to eat, the 2 sisters laughed happily. "We have rice, today we can eat rice." Gao took the bag and ran straight into the kitchen, stuffed it in her mouth and blew on it. The thirsty baby nestled into his mother's chest, sniffing and sniffing, his face clearly pitiful. She squatted down, let the baby lie on her lap, lifted her shirt up to feed him, cut sweet potatoes with both hands, mixed them with rice, added more water, then put it on the stove to cook. The baby nestled his face into suckle, sucked for a while without any milk coming out, so he jerked away and cried and sulked. Ms. Mean quickly switched sides to let the baby suckle, and the baby sucked and sucked. Perhaps both sides had not yet produced milk, but he was crying and sulking at the same time. Looking at the baby, she felt so sorry. She rubbed his cheek and caressed him. "Baby, wait for me a bit. Remember, the rice water is almost ready." She added more straw to make it boil faster. After a while, the pot of rice boiled loudly. She carefully took the pot down, poured the rice water into a bowl, blew on it to cool it down, then fed the baby. Spoonfuls of rice water. The hungry baby opened his mouth to eat continuously until the bowl of rice water was empty. Then he closed his eyes and slept. After the child fell asleep, she put him down on the bed. She went to the garden to pick sweet potato leaves to boil. The 2 girls looked at the pot of rice and stood next to the pot, salivating, ready to steal some. She smiled. "Waiting for the teacher to come home to eat, my child. The teacher is almost home." As soon as she finished speaking, she saw Tao carrying a hoe back, still holding a bunch of crucian carp in his hand. He threw the fish into the basket to wash his face, hands and feet, then sat down to prepare to eat. Looking at the pot of mixed rice, he asked his wife, "Do you have rice today, my child? Where did you get the money to buy rice?" She smiled gently and replied, "Today's money is for being a nanny for Mr. Fu's family." He asked, "So who are you nannying for? The children of Mr. Fu's family?" Ms. Mean lied, "Yes, my child." Today's meal was very sumptuous, with rice mixed with sweet potatoes, eggplants with soy sauce, and boiled sweet potato leaves. Tao looked at the rice and wanted to eat more, but looking at the children eating, he had to hold back his anger, stood up, picked up a bowl of green tea, and drank it all. She looked at her husband and asked softly, "Teacher, eat more, what about rice?" He replied, "Let her eat for the children. I'm full already." "Okay, I'll go catch frogs to get some meat for the children to eat." Going down to the kitchen, taking 2 baskets and a bamboo stick, Tao immediately left. Waiting for the 2 girls to finish eating, she washed the dishes and bathed the 2 girls. While bathing Gao, she told her, "From tomorrow, you go to work at Mr. Fu's house. If the younger sisters are hungry, take the rice from the bag and cook porridge for them to eat. Remember to add a lot of water, go to work, and then buy rice for them to eat." Gao said yes clearly. "Go to work, I'll stay home and look after the younger siblings." It was a bit rainy at night when Tao came back late with 2 baskets full of frogs. She took the basket of frogs, turned on the oil lamp, and sat down to skin and butcher them, conveniently making the whole batch of crucian carp from the afternoon. She washed the small crucian carp the size of a finger, put them in a clay pot, added a few eggplants and some fermented soybean paste, and brought them to the straw stove to cook. She also put the cleaned frogs in a clay pot, added a little salt, and boiled them. Tomorrow, they would have meat to eat, so the children would be very happy. Sitting there gathering straw, thinking that she had lied to the teacher today, the children felt extremely guilty, but if she told the truth that she was a nanny for dogs, and if this story got out, it would be extremely humiliating. Outside, it was still raining and the weather was a bit cooler. Brother Tao had gone to bed a long time ago, and she was still in the kitchen. She waited for the 2 pots to be cooked before she went to sleep. When the rooster crowed, dawn was breaking on the horizon. The 2 of them got up, sat down to boil a pot of sweet potatoes for him to eat first to gain strength for work. She took a small handful of rice from her rice bag, added a lot of water, and boiled it into a thin porridge. She called the children to wake up so the 2 children could eat porridge, while Gao had to eat boiled sweet potatoes with her mother. After feeding the child, she put on her hat and went to Mr. Fu's house. Sitting on the porch of Mr. Fu's house, waiting for Ms. Lu to bring the puppy out, she looked inside the house. Inside the house were mahogany beds, cabinets, and ironwood tables and chairs. The house had 5 rooms with red tiles. Talking about Mr. Fu's house, he was over 50 this year. The richest man in Tamha village, with a vast land in Buffalo, had 4 people living and working. It was said that Mr. Fu had many wives but few children, because he had 3 wives but only 2 children, 1 girl and 1 boy. The woman was Miss Lu, the daughter of Mr. Fu and the maid, and the boy was the son of Mrs. Ba. This year, Miss Lu was nearly 20 years old, and still had no one to ask for her hand in marriage. And Mr. Nam, the son of Mrs. Ba, was only about 10 years old. Miss Lu was like a thorn in the eye, and a thorn in the heart of the old lady. She lived with Mr. Fu for many years, but had no children. But somehow Mr. Fu had an affair with the maid and gave birth to Miss Lu. At that time, it was a disgrace to Mr. Fu's family. But because he had few children, he accepted this illegitimate child, only recognizing the child and not the mother. Mrs. Fu was afraid that her husband would have to endure the humiliation to let this illegitimate child stay here. With Mr. Fu's womanizing nature, he later brought home 2 more women. At that time, it was normal for men to have 5 wives and 7 concubines as long as they had enough money and rice to feed their wives and children. While sitting and looking around the house, Mr. and Mrs. Fu got up from the room and walked out, seeing Mr. and Mrs. Mean bowing down to greet them. "Hello, sir, hello, ma'am." Mr. Fu squinted at the woman and asked, "Who are you? What are you doing sitting in front of my porch?" She replied, "Yes, sir, I came to milk my aunt's western dogs." He replied, "Miss Liu's dogs, you better do it well. If you're clumsy, I'll beat you to death." "Yes, sir, I'll listen to your teachings." When the old lady heard about raising Miss Liu's dogs, she frowned. It's just a new dog, just let her suckle. What money to feed her milk, it's a waste of time. Mr. Fu snapped. Leave her alone, let her do whatever she wants. Spend my money, don't feel sorry for her. He grumbled and slapped her for a few hours. Mrs. Fu was silent and didn't dare to say anything. At that moment, the sound of wooden clogs clicking on the ground, Miss Lu from the inner house came out. She was wearing only a brown yem shirt and white satin pants. Her mouth was still yawning. When she saw her husband, she opened her mouth to greet the teacher, but didn't even bother to greet Mrs. Fu. She glanced at her and then sat down next to him to drink tea. The maid gave Miss Min 2 bowls like the day before. She received them, turned to the corner of the wall and covered them carefully with her hat, then sat down and filled 2 bowls with milk and gave them to the maid. When she finished, she bowed to her grandparents and said goodbye to her and went home. Since the day Miss Min became a wet nurse at Mr. Fu's house, the money she had every day was enough for 2 meals for the children. With money, she occasionally bought some fried cakes and sweet potato cakes for the children. Every time the children saw their mother coming home, they shouted with joy. Siyu had to stop breastfeeding and eat thin porridge because if she breastfed him, she wouldn't have much milk left to feed the other Western puppies. She gritted her teeth and listened to her child's thirst for milk and coaxed him to eat porridge. Talking about Mr. Fu's daughter Lu. Ms. Lu has white skin, a beautiful face, and a graceful figure, but unfortunately she has an arrogant personality because her family is rich. Even though she is an illegitimate child, she is pampered by her father, especially when she started to grow up to be this beautiful. The first wife always finds ways to bully Ms. Lu, but she is not afraid because she has her father on her side. Whoever dares to touch her, he will beat them to death. I still remember the time the maid brought her a bowl of stewed chicken to eat. The maid was only about 13 years old, and while carrying the bowl of chicken, I don't know if it was hot or not, but she slipped and knocked the bowl over, breaking it into pieces, sending shards of porcelain flying into her leg, causing a dribble of blood to flow out. Ms. Lu screamed loudly, grabbed the kettle of hot water on the table, poured it on the maid's face, grabbed her hair, and slapped her several times. Mr. Fu heard his daughter screaming and ran out to see his daughter crying and telling on the servant. Mr. Fu looked at his daughter and felt sorry for her. He immediately took a stick and beat the servant until she almost died. He beat the servant until she was unconscious. Mr. and Mrs. Fu's family had a reputation for being evil, but because of poverty, people still had to send their children to work for him. Some people said that Mr. Fu went to collect the rent for Mrs. Lim's land. They didn't know how the rice harvest was that year, but they still owed Mr. Fu 20 dong. He asked for money but didn't have money to pay, so he forced Mrs. Lim's eldest daughter to work as his servant to pay the debt, and only when the debt was paid would she return. Mrs. Lim's daughter was the servant girl who was beaten unconscious. As for the eldest wife of his family, there were no words or songs to describe her. Those who worked for her were mistreated and beaten indiscriminately, and she picked on every little thing. From the betel nut she ate, if she was not careful and not pretty, she would take the betel spittoon and hit her hand until it was crippled. Every time she finished eating, she would sit and count every piece of meat and fish left over. Here, remember, there are 5 pieces of ham, 3 pieces of meat, she has counted them all. Any son or daughter who dares to steal food, I will break your fucking teeth. The servant said yes and immediately carried the tray down to the kitchen, only daring to eat the leftover rice and soup. The second wife of his family was a singer from the province. At that time he went to the province for business and stayed at a brothel. When he met her, he was fascinated by her singing and playing the zither, so he brought her home. The third wife was a concubine because the teacher did not have enough money to rent the land. When he married the other 2 wives, the first wife was filled with resentment and was afraid that he would have to suffer the fate of having to share a husband. The golden rice fields with ripe rice hanging down meant the harvest season had come. The hot sun made the couple diligently cut the rice, put it on a shoulder pole to carry it home. Sweat was dripping down her shirt as she carried the rice and stacked it in the yard. The fragrant smell of ripe rice wafted throughout the yard. The children were sitting and threshing the rice for their teacher to play with. The little boy had already learned to walk and babbled, calling teacher and mother. The 2 girls had been fed and drank enough, and looked a little taller. Sitting holding a hat and fanning herself, she rested her hands and watched the children playing on the ground. Looking at the piles of rice lying on the ground, the couple smiled happily and said to their husband, "Teacher, look, this year seems to be a good harvest. Luckily, God loves us poor people. The weather is so good, There are no storms or floods like last year. Antao held the bowl of tea and drank it all in one gulp, smiling. Boo is right. This year, God loves us, so the harvest is good. If it is good, there will be rice for the children to eat. Sitting down to rest, the sweat dried, then went back to the field to cut rice. Each load of rice was so heavy that the shoulders were tired from carrying the heavy load. After 3 days of harvesting rice in the field, it was time to thresh the rice. A large pot was set up to prevent the rice grains from flying far away when threshing. Underneath the pot were a few sticks placed horizontally to beat the rice grains. After eating boiled potatoes, the couple used a gourd to thresh the rice. The rice grains fell out and scattered everywhere. The sweet aroma of the rice was very pleasant. After 2 days of hard work, the rice was threshed from the stalks. Ms. Mean held a rake and spread it out in the yard to dry in the sun. Looking at the results of his whole year, Mr. Tao sat on the ground and smiled with satisfaction. The 3 children ran around and played on the ground, laughing and joking. They were very happy because they would have rice to eat. About 3 days later, Mr. Fu and his wife came to collect the land rent. The 2 of them bowed and greeted the grandparents. When the children saw strangers, they huddled together in the kitchen and looked out. The grandparents came with 4 other families. Mr. Fu strutted in and cleared his throat. It seems like you guys have a good harvest this year. Come on, Mrs. Mean, go weigh and measure and then go to another guy's house. Mr. Tao carried out a bamboo bed and invited him to sit. Ms. Mean's shirt was soaked with sweat, so she clung to him. He quickly poured 2 bowls of tea and invited the grandparents to have some. Mr. Fu reached out to take the bowls, tears in his eyes, not forgetting to stare at Ms. Mean's full breasts. The First Lady saw this scene, and her mouth bled. She screamed, "You whore, come here. Are you trying to make me die of thirst? I'll beat you to death right now." Sister Mean hurriedly brought water to the First Lady. She used her chubby hands to grab the bowl of water, not forgetting to dig her nails into her wrists so hard that they bled. When she was settled, the First Lady ordered the servants to bring out the rice to weigh, while she sat down and opened the book to calculate and write it down. After weighing everything, she started to calculate. The land rent for 1 year, I'll convert it to 40 bushels. 1 bushel of rice equals 40 pounds. The price for the rice seeds you borrowed from me is 1 bushel. Plus the money to hire the servants to come here and collect the rice for me, it's 2 bushels more. Total, 43 bushels of rice. It's all in the book. Your father, Meng, has owed me 50 bushels of rice for a long time now, and I'll collect it all. The 2 of them stood there listening to the old lady calculate the bill, completely stunned. Mean knelt down and clasped her hands in prayer. Yes, ma'am, last year my family has already arranged to pay off all 50 bushels of rice that my grandfather borrowed from you. Please review it carefully for me. The old lady glared and shouted, "You fucking bitch, you've never lied to me. This is properly recorded in my book. You've never lied to me for a single grain of rice. How dare you argue with me?" Mrs. C.A. kicked Ms. Mean, making her fall down. She sobbed and cried, "I beg you. Who dares to lie? Last year, I reminded you of the debt, and I've already collected it. Hoo-hoo, please take a good look at my family." Antao stood next to him and saw his wife being beaten, about to rush up to fight. 2 servants grabbed him by the neck and pinned him to the ground. The children standing in the kitchen were scared and cried loudly. Mrs. C.A. threw the stack of papers on the ground, holding her head and shoving her into the stack of papers. "Open your eyes wide and see. The documents are complete. There are still your father's fingerprints." Ms. Mean was pushed down by her and her nose hit the ground, blood flowing from her nostrils. The pain of looking at the stack of papers that she didn't understand anything because she couldn't read, and even if she could read, there was nothing to prove or argue with her. She had to sadly hand over the stack of papers to the eldest lady. "I'm blind, please forgive me. I beg you to pay for the rice that our family borrowed." The eldest lady spat the beetle nut on the ground, wiped her lips and said, "You guys saw it with your own eyes. Oh no, you've soiled my papers, it's ruined. Pay for it, you bitch. You can't die without paying for this stack of papers." The eldest lady looked at the stack of papers that had a few drops of nose blood on them and started to make a fuss. Mr. Fu looked at them again and then frowned and said, "1 sheet of paper is 5 cents. Here are 30 sheets. How are you going to pay for it?" Sister Mean trembled as she looked at the stack of papers and cried, I beg you, please forgive my family." "Son, my family has no money." Mr. Fu looked at her and smiled. "If you don't have money, then use someone to pay. Anyway, you are currently working as a nanny for my Western dog." Now you don't have money to pay, then go there, and work for free for a year is enough. Hearing that, the two of them knelt down. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Mr. and Mrs. Fu turned away to let the 4 servants carry the rice home. When they were gone, they dared to sit up. Mr. Tao looked at his wife and asked, what did Mr. Fu say his mother was a nanny for the Western dog? His mother said I went there to be a nanny for his cousin. Ms. Mean held her nose in pain and whispered, the teacher forgive me. I actually come every day to milk Ms. Liu's dog to drink. Hoo, I lied to the teacher. Seeing his wife clearly suffering, Mr. Tao didn't say anything, looked at the scattered rice in the yard, and sat down to pick it up. Ms. Mean ran into the kitchen to comfort her child. Just a moment ago, the house was full of rice, thinking that after this harvest, we would pay off the debt and still have rice left over for seeds and rice for our children to eat. But now it's all taken away. How heartbreaking. What a miserable fate. The dog bit the torn shirt. A whole year of hard work in the field was now robbed. Tao held his head and looked out into the yard and sighed. Ms. Mean came closer and whispered to comfort her husband. Oh, teacher. Everything was taken away. This year there will be another year to pay off the debt for the old man. The old man also passed away. Tao turned back to look at his wife and stroked her calloused hands. Does it still hurt? Well, what's lost is still there. Next year we'll try harder. Ms. Mean sadly bowed her head. The couple silently looked at their 3 young children. For the sake of their children they had to try everything. The next morning, he went to the field to pick up the remaining rice in the field. The 3 children stayed home to eat sweet potatoes and wait for the teacher. Ms. Mean went to Mr. Fu's house to milk the rice. After she finished her work, she asked for permission to leave. At this time, he came downstairs and called her to the gate and whispered, yesterday I couldn't do anything about the matter of your beating. Here, I have a piece of ham as compensation for the loss. Take it home for them to eat. She didn't dare to accept it, so he just shoved it into her hand. After he gave it to her, she went straight into the house. She carefully put the ham in her pocket and brought it home. That noon, she cut the ham into many small pieces the size of a finger joint, carefully divided it into 2 pieces for each child, and gave it to her husband. Tao shook her head and refused to eat it, but she didn't eat it either, leaving it all for her child. Gao put the ham in her mother's mouth. Eat the ham, it's delicious, mother. She smiled. I don't like ham. I only like sweet potatoes. Eat it. The little girl looked at her mother with wide eyes and looked at the ham again. So you don't like it? Yes, you don't like it. The meals all year round were corn and sweet potatoes, and occasionally there was a little frog, crab, and snail meat for a change. Called a change of dish, but that's all there is to eat. That night at Mr. Fu's house, Mr. Fu couldn't sleep when his mind was filled with the full breasts of Mean. He thought to himself, she has many children, wears ragged clothes, and is miserable, but she is still very beautiful. He looks at her with longing. Then Mean's plump, but makes him feel uncomfortable and restless. Lying down, he turns to look at Mrs. Ba, who is sleeping. She eats well and sleeps well. Her body is already full of layers of fat. He looks at it until he is sick of it. Sometimes he loses interest. He sits up and walks out to the yard for some fresh air. Suddenly he sees someone's shadow lurking at the door of Liu's room, which is slightly open, so he walks over to take a closer look. From Liu's room, there is a shirtless young man with bulging abdominal muscles. That guy is pressing Liu against the edge of the door, his hand in Liu's pants, touching the other guy's mouth that is sucking Liu's breasts. This one did not struggle to resist, but instead closed its eyes in satisfaction, and let out a soft squeal of pleasure. He looked at it with burning eyes and shouted, there's a thief, you bastard. Where are you guys? Catch him for me. His shout startled the 2 people who were entangled with each other and separated. He rushed in and grabbed the young man who struggled to escape. At that moment, 4 servants with sticks and torches ran out and beat the other man to a pulp. Liu, her clothes disheveled, ran into the room and closed the door, not daring to show her face. The scene he had just seen was so intense that he ordered someone to beat the other man to death. The sticks as big as pestles hit the young man's head and body, then his body was covered in blood and lay motionless. The incident caused a stir, and the women rushed out to see. He was afraid that the rumor would spread far and wide, so he just said that this man was a thief and that he had caught him and beaten him to death. The thief's body was taken by the servants and thrown away by the pond that very night. After beating the thief to death, Mr. Fu vented his anger and lay down on the bed, but the image of Liu with her eyes half closed, her mouth panting, her tank top slipping off, her pants falling down to her knees in some places, was clearly imprinted in his mind. Below her was a squirming cock. He lay there breathing heavily. He frowned, and a miserable idea popped into his head. I raised you for so many years like flowers and tears, and you dare to give it to another guy. Humph humph, everything in this house and land is mine. Mr. Fu seemed to have lost his mind, sat up, and went out to the yard near Liu's room. He didn't go in right away, but opened his eyes to look through the door to observe. In her room, Liu was wearing only a tank top and thin pants hugging her body, sweat dripping down, clearly visible. Mr. Fu stood outside, saliva flowing out, making him swallow hard. Gently pushing the door open, Liu was lying down with tears in her eyes because when Mr. Fu beat that guy to death, it scared her. Before, it was normal for Mr. Fu to beat someone to death, but this time the dead person was someone she liked. Hearing footsteps, Liu turned around, saw Mr. Fu. She jumped up and explained, "Teacher, it was that guy who seduced me. I don't know anything." Mr. Fu's whole body was now burning hot. His eyes stared at his daughter's undulating breasts, swallowing his saliva, and said, "Yes, I believe you. It was him who seduced me. This bad news cannot be spread outside. But if you ask me, I have to tell you. Has he done anything to you yet?" Liu pouted and replied, "No, nothing." Mr. Fu was a little happy in his heart and asked again, "So if I haven't done anything, I'm still intact?" Liu replied, "I'm still a virgin." Hearing this, Mr. Fu smiled slyly. He sat down on the bed and put his hand in Liu's hand and whispered in a deep, broken voice, "I raised you for so many years. Everything here is mine. The same goes for you." Seeing Liu's face, she froze. "Then you are my daughter. Why do you speak so strangely?" "Mr. Fu said, what is mine is yours, what is yours is mine. Be a good girl, and let me do something to you." Liu was stunned. She couldn't believe her ears and stammered, "What are you saying? You are my daughter." Mr. Fu's voice was deep. In his head there was no longer any morality. Without saying anything, he pressed Liu down on the bed and violently pulled off her shirt and stuffed it into her mouth. He opened his mouth and greedily pounced on Liu. Liu was scared and fought back, but couldn't. 2 lines of tears fell because the person who was raping her was the one who given birth to her. After a while of struggling, Mr. Fu stopped, pulled up his pants, looked down at the blood on the mat, and laughed miserably. "From now on, what is yours is mine. What is mine is yours. Whatever you like, I will do it for you. Just obediently serve you. No one dares to touch you. This is a top secret. If you tell, you will die." Liu nodded with tears streaming down her face. Old Fu immediately went upstairs. Now Ms. Min had been working for Mr. Fu's family for almost a month. The puppies already knew how to eat porridge, so milk was no longer necessary. Instead of having to milk the puppies, the first wife forced her to do more cooking, washing, and paying off the debt, working until the evening before she could go home. She had to work hard to quickly pay off the debt. Since the day old Fu raped his daughter, he became healthy again, eating well, sleeping well, talking and laughing, and feeling comfortable and satisfied. As for Liu, from that day until now, she felt like she was living in hell in her own home. After that miserable night, the man she called master came every night to do it, not just once but sometimes twice to satisfy him. Recently, he also ordered a bottle of seahorse wine to drink to increase Liu's health. She was humiliated and wanted to live but couldn't, and wanted to die but couldn't. The needle in the bag will eventually come out. One night, Mrs. Hai could not sleep. She was in the prime of her youth, and inside her, there was a smoldering fire that wanted to burn her whole body. That night, she tossed and turned without Mr. Fu's presence, so she was very angry. She went out to the yard to wait for Tam to come. Tam, who had been carrying water for a long time, had been Mrs. Hai's lover. These 2 people, one without a wife and the other without a husband, after a few times of flirting, Mrs. Hai fell into the arms of Tam. The 2 of them were intimate with each other, sometimes in the backyard, sometimes in the grapefruit garden. Whenever it was dark and Mr. Fu was not sleeping in her room, she would wait until late at night to sneak out to the yard and pretend to make the sound of a gecko. The other boy would understand and run out to hug each other. Now Liu was on her period and could not please the rich man. He resentfully walked out of her room. When he passed by some grapefruit trees, he suddenly heard the sound of a man's heavy breathing and the sound of a woman's squealing. The old man stood still listening and slowly approached to examine, because he thought some servant was having an affair. The dim moonlight was right at the base of the grapefruit tree. The 2 were entangled with each other, not knowing what was going on. Old Fu gradually moved closer to take a closer look. At that moment, Mrs. Hai exhaled and said something to Tam. Old Fu clearly heard Mrs. Hai's voice. He was like a madman. He bent down to pick up the clogs under his feet and hit the dirty couple. He kept hitting the other man's head with his clogs, shouting loudly for the servants to run out with torches. Tam was tied up and dragged out to the yard. Mrs. Hai lay on the ground, haphazardly grabbing some clothes to cover herself. Old Fu grabbed Mrs. Hai's hair and dragged her out to the yard for interrogation. Mrs. Hai was so noble, now she was humiliated, not even wearing any clothes, kneeling on the ground, using her hands to cover her body. When they had finished confessing, the two incestuous men were hanged to death by Old Fu. Tam's body was thrown onto the ground for wild dogs to gnaw on. Mrs. Hai was buried in the ground behind the garden. The eldest wife saw everything and smiled sinisterly. She thought that the two children would die. The lighter the food, the less jealous she would be. The news that Mrs. Hai's affair was discovered and then killed spread throughout the village, and everyone was talking about it. Many people even caught Mrs. Mean and asked her about it, but she shook her head and said nothing. At that time, her husband Tao was working for Mr. Fu. He had to stay to be his servant because Mr. Fu did not let his family rent land to farm anymore. They had no money to raise their children, so both husband and wife had to work for him. Mrs. Mean had to leave the 3 children with her grandparents to look after during the day and pick them up at night. As for Miss Lu, after the days of being humiliated by Mr. Fu, she suddenly became weak and vomited. Mrs. Ca was surprised and asked many times, but was scolded by Mr. Fu and not allowed to ask. Miss Liu's belly grew bigger and bigger, as if she was pregnant. The news that Miss Lu was pregnant out of wedlock was spread out. Then one day, Mr. Fu went to the district and did not return for a month. In his room, Miss Lu gave birth to a child. Mrs. Ca heard Liu's painful screams while giving birth and ran down to see. When she arrived, the baby was born. Mrs. Ca looked at Lu with hatred and interrogated her. "You whore with an out of wedlock, you are no different from your mother's slave. Whose child is this?" Lu rolled her eyes and said, "Your child. You slept with me and gave birth to this child. From now on, this child is the head of the family. You have no right to interrogate me." The first wife heard, and her legs went limp. Could it be that the rumors of the servants were true? They rumored that Mr. Fu and Ms. Lu often slept together. Oh my God, incest, incest. The first wife rushed in, grabbed Liu's hair, pulled her out of bed, and cursed and beat her. "Damn you whore, you're so miserable. Incest! You seduced your own father to steal his house and land. You whore!" An Tao, who was sleeping in the kitchen, heard the curses and ran out to see what was going on. He only saw a newborn baby boy kicking and crying on the bed, and the first wife was beating Ms. Lu. Not understanding what was going on, he rushed in to protect Ms. Lu and begged her to forgive him. At that time, the servants and villagers around ran over with torches. To cure this humiliation for her family, she said with a fierce voice, "Damn that bastard, we pitied you and took you home to raise. Who would have thought that you raped my daughter until she got pregnant? Oh my God, my country. My family has been raising monkeys and bees to spy on our house. Oh my God. Where are you guys? Beat this guy to death for me." She shouted that the 4 servants knew that this was not true because when Tao came here, Liu's belly was already bulging. He was definitely framed. They stood still and did not dare to take action. The eldest wife was furious when she saw that they did not act. "Whoever does not beat this traitor to death today, I will send them to the Western Court to be shot." Hearing about being shot dead by the French, they were scared and stammered, "I'm sorry, my brother. I didn't mean to." The first wife screamed, despite Tao's pleas of innocence. "Ma'am, I'm so wronged, ma'am." The servants rushed at him with sticks and beat him up. In the chaos, the eldest wife quickly picked up the child and strangled him to death, then gave him to the maid and threw him down the well. Brother Tao was brutally beaten, his body was covered in blood, his head was smashed open by the stick, his limbs were broken and dangling, he lay in a pool of blood, his mouth opened and yawned a few times before he died. Sister Mean was at home putting the children to sleep, not knowing why tonight her heart and stomach were burning like fire and she couldn't sleep. Suddenly there was the sound of footsteps running and knocking on her door. When she opened the door, she saw a maid following Miss Lu, her eyes and nose running, sobbing, "Come to the rich man's house quickly, Uncle Tao is dead." Hearing the bad news, she didn't have time to tie her hair. She ran to the neighbor's house and knocked on the door to ask him to come and help her look after the children, then ran to Mr. Fu's house on all fours. When she arrived, The villagers were standing outside the gate with torches. She pushed everyone away and ran in. Her husband Tao was lying dead, surrounded by a large pool of blood. Looking at her husband lying there, she rushed to hug him and cried. Mrs. CA sat in the middle of the yard and continued to accuse and curse him. Ms. Mean, with disheveled hair, screamed her husband's name in such pain that she fainted. When she woke up, it was morning. She was lying on her grandparents' bed looking after the children. Her husband Tao's body was wrapped in a torn mat and placed in the middle of the house. On his head was a bunch of green bananas and a few incense sticks. It was so simple that it hurt her heart. She cried and cried because of her husband's death. She just wanted to die with her husband, but looking at her young children, she could not leave them behind. Tao's funeral took place quickly. People put him on a cart and pulled him to the cemetery, dug a hole in the ground, put him in the ground and filled it up, ending a miserable life. Sister Mean hugged her husband's newly dug grave and cried until her voice was hoarse and lost. Her eyes and nose were swollen as she looked up to the sky and screamed in despair. "Oh God, please bend down and see, my dear. My husband died so unjustly, my dear. What sin did my family commit to be killed? Oh God, oh God. Those evil and immoral people killed my husband, my dear. Oh my God, you're dead. How can my mother and I live, my dear? Oh God, how high is the sky and deep is the earth? Oh my God, you're dead." Screaming out in agony, Sister Mean threw herself into the newly dug mound of dirt, wanting to die with him. Several women hugged her and stopped her. "Calm down, come on, don't do that. There's nothing left of a dead person. Look at those 3 children. If their mother dies, who will be there for them to rely on?" She wanted to follow her teacher, but looking at her 3 young children, she could not let them go. The 3 young children saw their mother crying and cried, and Gao knew that her teacher had died. The other 2 children looked at her, and her mother crying and cried, not understanding why. In that thatched house with mud walls, 4 miserable people sat on the ground, absent-mindedly. A weak woman with no one to look after her 3 young children, who were not yet grown up. Ms. Mean, who was very thin, looked up at the bamboo table where her husband was worshipped. On the bamboo table, there was a bamboo card engraved with Tao's name by a literate scholar, a bunch of green bananas, a boiled chicken, and a plate of sticky rice that the neighbors had contributed a little bit each to buy and sell to make Tao a decent gift. The neighborly love of the poor people was given as much as they could. When everyone had finished burying him, she knelt down on the ground and kowtowed to thank them. "I thank you for helping my mother and I. I will keep this favor in my heart." Everyone helped her up. Her mother stood up. The village spirit helped when the lights were out. "It's late, we'll go home now." They had left, and Ms. Mean's grandparents went down to the kitchen to cook a pot of thin porridge and brought it up to their daughter. "Come on, my child. Eat a few bites to gain strength to live and feed them. Now you're the only one they can rely on. Hoo-hoo, if anything happens to you, I'll probably die with you, my child." Ms. Mean sat there, staring blankly at the bowl of porridge. She whispered, "Her father really craved porridge, my child, but he didn't dare to eat it. He went hungry to give it to his children. Until he died, his stomach was still flat on his back." Speaking of this, Ms. Mean cried again. Her mother comforted and advised her with all kinds of things until she opened her mouth to drink her porridge. Only then did she feel at ease. It was late at night when the 2 of them felt at ease and went home. Everyone had gone home, leaving only Ms. Mean and her 4 children. The villagers felt sorry for her. Some gave her sweet potatoes, some gave her a handful of rice, some gave her a basket of peanuts, hoping to help her a little. She collapsed from exhaustion and fell asleep, not knowing what she was dreaming, crying and laughing. The rooster crowed loudly. Ms. Mean, as usual, sat up and went out to the porch near the well to see where her husband was, only to realize that he was no longer alive. She cried again and went into the middle room to light a stick of incense for her husband. The white smoke lingered around her for a while before disappearing. Sitting in front of the altar, her husband reached out and rubbed the bamboo card with his name engraved on it, as if wanting to touch him and feel the warmth and comfort from his husband. The 3 children were already awake by the bed. Noah had just opened her eyes and was already crying out that she was hungry. She looked up at her husband's altar and asked to lower the chicken and the sticky rice plate for her to eat. The story of their teacher's death had already flashed through the children's minds. Seeing the chicken and sticky rice, the 3 children were eager to eat. She cut the meat into small pieces, rolled it into a ball of sticky rice, and gave it to her children. Seeing them eat, she cried and mumbled, "When my teacher died, I got to eat sticky rice." She said, oh teacher, How painful it was to hear this. The children were full and ran to play in the yard, while she just sat there looking at her husband's altar. When she left the children to look after her, she immediately went to the cemetery to visit her husband's grave. Day after day, they went one after another until more than a week later. Mr. Fu from the province had returned. He had planned that by this time, Lu would give birth, so he bought many gifts, silk, brocade, and rouge from the province for her. Because he loved her and considered her as his wife, not his child. The fetus in her belly seemed to be a boy because her pregnant belly was pointed out. Sitting on the cart, Mr. Fu wanted to go home quickly to pamper Lu and her daughter. When he got close to his field, he heard the poor people talking to each other, saying something like they were committing adultery and then beating Min to death. Mr. Fu frowned and shouted, "Damn these poor people, you don't even greet me." A few people who were busy chatting heard his shout and stood up in surprise and bowed to him. Mr. Fu then asked, "What are you guys talking about? Which one committed adultery and which one died?" The villagers then brought up the story of that night when the eldest wife caught Lu giving birth in the room. Then the eldest wife said Tao had committed adultery with her. Hearing this part, Mr. Fu felt that Lu and her daughter were more innocent than evil, so he used his baton to hit the cart puller, urging him to quickly go home. Arriving at the gate of Mr. Fu's house, he immediately ran into Lu's room to see how she was doing. He only saw Lu lying on the bed, her belly flat and no longer bulging like before he left. Looking around, he didn't see any children around Lu. He went near her and woke her up. Lu saw that her teacher had returned and immediately cried and told her the story of the first wife strangling her newborn son to death. Mr. Fu bent down and kissed her eyes and face to comfort her. Lu hugged her teacher and cried and cried. Mr. Fu and Lu had an incestuous affair for a whole year and considered each other as a married couple. Now seeing Lu crying like that, he felt sorry for his newborn son. He was furious, took his cane and went upstairs to call the first wife out. When the first wife saw him coming back and intending to spread the story of the two children's adultery, Mr. Fu said nothing and slapped her until her mouth bled. After that, he kept kicking and beating her stomach. The first wife lay on the ground screaming. The third wife ran out to watch and pretended to stop the old man, but conveniently slapped the first wife a few times because this first wife had always been cruel to the third wife. When the first wife was knocked unconscious, the old man ordered someone to drag the first wife down to the granary and lock her up. He told the servants not to let her out, but to give her 3 proper meals a day. After saying that, the old man went downstairs to bring a bag of gifts and cosmetics to coax Lu. When she saw the many gifts and cosmetics, she smiled and let Mr. Fu Thay put his hand into her shirt to caress her. The third wife knew everything that happened in the house, even the story of Mr. Fu's incest with Lu. How could she not know? That night, she had trouble sleeping, so she went out to the yard to take a walk. When she got close to Lu's room, she saw the door slightly open, Mr. Fu pressing down on her. Then Lu turned on him and bounced. The third wife stood outside looking in, eyes wide open, mouth agape in surprise, not daring to make a sound. Then she gently walked into her room and lay still. 2 days after Mr. Fu returned, he immediately went to Ms. Min's house, pretending to be heartbroken over the unjust death of Mr. Tao. He acted as if he was so heartbroken and sympathetic that he had no words to say. "My dear Min, this matter was caused by my wife not knowing right from wrong and accidentally killing her. I don't know what to say, so I'll give you some money as compensation for your mental damage. You still owe me paper money and haven't paid off the debt yet. Now that your husband is dead, he still owes me. Now you have to make me pay off the debt for both you and him." Ms. Min sobbed and said, "I beg you, I owe you money, please help me pay off the debt. If not, you can take the land that my family lives on. I'll pay off the debt for you." Mr. Fu said sternly, "Your dilapidated house is only worth a few coins, but you want to fake a debt for me. I sympathize with your situation as a widow and orphan. You have to be reasonable with me, otherwise I'll force your 3 children to be sold to the province." Hearing that he wanted to capture the children, Ms. Min hugged his feet and cried and begged, I beg you, please forgive me. Don't capture the children, it's a pity for them. Now whatever you say, I'll listen." Mr. Fu looked at the woman with big round eyes, a strong body that was plump wherever it needed to be, and plump wherever it needed to be. He looked down at her butt and thought, mother and son with a wasp waist, that butt is so thin. Later on, you will only have sons, haha. Mr. Fu cleared his throat, ahem. Now I calculate like this. You can mortgage this broken house to me as half the paper money you ruined last time. You will have to pay for half a year without pay, remember? Then the money your husband still owes when renting the land, and the money he borrowed from me last time to treat your child's illness. Now I calculate that you have to work for me for 6 years. For free. As for the 3 children, I will give them the money I showed you earlier to someone to raise. I will temporarily give that money to someone else to raise the children. Ms. Mean cried and said yes, because if she dared to resist him, she and her child would only have a dead end. She asked him to let her come back to work in 2 days. Mr. Fu laughed and showed her a piece of paper asking her to print her index finger to confirm. Actually, when he was at home, he had already thought of a plan to trick Ms. Mean into coming to work as his concubine. Ms. Mean rolled her finger in ink and printed it. That was it. From now on, the family was ruined, and there was no place to return to. Seeing Mr. Fu go far away, she hugged her child and sat in front of her husband's altar, crying until her voice was hoarse. She wanted to hug her child and still follow her husband, but looking at her 3 young children, she couldn't bear it. She had to gather a few torn clothes, Tao's bamboo card with her name on it, a few hoe blades, plow blades, sweet potatoes, peanuts, and leftover rice that people gave her, put them in a basket on her head, one hand holding the basket on top of Gao's head, one hand holding the puppy with the other hand, holding No's hand and following her mother. Kang Gao did not know where her mother was going, so she asked, "Mother, why are you going? Aren't you at home?" Her tears flowed as she told her child, "Mother, you've given the house to Mr. Fu. Now go to your grandparents' house and miss him." Kang Gao said yes, then followed her mother. The evening light shone down on the dirt road, for small people walked hand in hand. Their shadows fell long on the ground. When they arrived at her sister's house, she took the children inside and told them to go out to the yard to play with the dogs. After the children had run and played, she knelt down at the feet of her mother and asked her to help her raise the 3 children. She had to work for Mr. Fu's family for 6 years without pay. Or maybe the old man looked at her with a broken heart, suddenly at peace. She was separated. Out of pity for her children and grandchildren, the 2 grandparents adopted the children for her. She held the basket, which contained the most valuable things to her. She gave the basket along with the money that Mr. Fu gave her, told the 2 elders a few things, then bowed to them 3 times and ran away, afraid that her children would follow her. It took half a day to go from Bu's house to Mr. Fu's house. Early in the morning, she stood in front of his house and called. Mr. Fu happily limped out of the house. He fed her and took her to the kitchen corner near the warehouse for her to stay. Every day, from early morning until late at night, she did housework for him. Occasionally, Mr. Fu happily gave her a few coins as a bonus and let her go home to visit her children once a month. Ms. Mean was very happy, although a bit scared. She still reached out to receive the money and ran home to visit her children, giving the money to Mr. Bu. She hugged her 3 children and told them a few things before running back immediately. The 3 children cried and followed their mother all the way to the gate. Grandmother ran out to hold them back. The child's cry clung to her head. "Bu, let me follow my new Bu. I miss you so much, Bu." She ran and cried, "Please forgive me. I will come back to visit you next month." When she got back to Mr. Fu's house, it was almost dark. She hurriedly went to the kitchen to cook rice and bring it up to him. He didn't blame her, he just looked at her and smiled, because soon she would have to lie in his arms. Since the day she was locked in the warehouse, the first wife had been screaming and begging him. Then she had been blaming and cursing them like a crazy woman screaming all day. As for Lu, after months and months, she had been serving Mr. Fu every night like husband and wife. Mrs. Ba stayed in the house with her son and had to pretend to be deaf and mute to live peacefully. She hoped that Mr. Fu would die quickly, so that all the property would belong to her son. The son was now about 16 to 17 years older than her. At this age, he started to practice partying and drinking with the wives of Mr. Lai and Mr. Nei's sons. Once, he saw his teacher riding on Lu. He stared at the whole body of the bird, gradually getting hotter, wriggling and pecking at the rice. He reached down to catch the bird and turned it around many times. When the rich man exhaled, his bird went to sleep. He hid in a corner and watched the rich man leave Liu's room. Waiting for him to return to his room, he still stood there, looking through the crack of the door where Lu was lying there. From then on, in his mind, there was only the image of Lu. How many times had he peeked at Lu? In his mind, he only wanted to do one thing: meet Lu, that illegitimate sister. One day, when his teacher went to a party in the village, he boldly drank some wine and sneaked into the room at midnight, pressed Lu down and did it. At first, Lu was mumbling and pushing him away, but he grabbed his younger brother and moaned in satisfaction. Lu was a lustful girl who had an affair with her half-brother for several months until he was sent to the province to study. After a month, a friend of Mr. Fu came to ask for Lu's hand in marriage. Lu was called to see him. When looking at her face, the friend's son, too, nodded immediately. Miss Lu and Mr. Fu saw the guests off, hesitantly not answering. That night, after having fun, Lu leaned against the rich man and said she was pregnant. Mr. Fu worriedly asked how long Lu had been pregnant and said it was probably about a month. Mr. Fu calculated in his mind that Lu needed to marry her right away because this friend was a business partner in the province and could not make him angry. Lu heard how rich the family was there and nodded. Lu's wedding quickly took place when the fetus in her belly was 2 months old, but it was unclear whether the father of this child was her teacher or her half-brother. Since Lu got married, the rich man changed his target to Ms. Min. One rainy night, he crushed her. In extreme pain and humiliation, she banged her head against the wall but could not die. The rich man hired a doctor to treat her and sent her to live in the upper room. In his coma, Tao looked at his wife with resentful eyes and shook his head. She begged her husband to forgive her. He just stood there and looked at her, then gradually moved away. After 2 months of curing her illness, old Fu forced her to stay in the house upstairs, giving her good food, nice clothes, and money. Every time she refused to be intimate, he threatened her with the 3 children and the priest. When she returned home after a month, she immediately rushed to visit the priest and her children. The priest looked at her with pity and borrowed some rice to cook porridge. Smelling the porridge boiling in the kitchen, Ms. Min suddenly covered her mouth and vomited, looking blankly at her stomach, then stood up and covered her face, crying, running away from the priest's house. Wiping her tears, she ran to the cemetery. Hugging her husband's grave, she whispered an apology for not being able to raise her children and not being able to fulfill her duty as a wife. Her heart ached as if thousands of knives were piercing it. Those who had not been in the same situation could not understand the pain of a broken home. As a woman with no support, poor and unable to eat, unable to speak, who would listen or defend her? Even if she sued the authorities without any money, the power of the old Fu family was so great that the authorities had to respect her to some extent. The only losers were these poor and destitute people. Before her eyes, the sky had already darkened. Groping in the dark, Ms. Min at that time really just wanted to die because the old Fu family was so cruel that many people came to work for free, and no one would have a chance to return. Not knowing how desperate she was, she groped her way to the river by the village. Standing there with the river wind blowing fiercely, she softly said, "Teacher Bukan, I'm sorry. Teacher, you guys let my mother apologize. I don't want to live anymore. Teacher Bu is waiting for me." Ms. Min closed her eyes and threw herself into the dark, quiet river. Hair. Cool drops of water fell and touched Min's eyes. A bit of bitter water gently flowed into her tongue. Min swallowed and slowly opened her eyes. She was lying in a dirt house. Next to Min was a woman with gray hair, cloudy eyes, and a wrinkled face. She spoke in a hoarse voice. "Why did you fall into the river when everything was fine? You're dead. What's the matter with the baby in your belly? When I took your pulse, I calculated that the baby was about 3 months old." Min suddenly burst into tears and told the painful and humiliating story of her family and herself. The old woman sat listening with a cold face and asked, "Are you Mr. Fu from Tam Ha village?" Min nodded and said yes. It was him who ruined her family and her husband, and she died unjustly. The old woman sat silently, using her cloudy eyes to look deep into Min's eyes and asked, "Do you want revenge? You have to make them die without a whole body." Min nodded and said in a stiff voice, "Yes. Revenge. I want to take revenge on the one who harmed my family." The old lady laughed coldly. "I am the old man's servant. That year, he raped me and made me pregnant. His wife tortured and beat me to make me confess who made me pregnant. She used a whip to whip me, and used a knife to slash my face when I said, 'That old Fu did it.' He sat on the chair and looked down, laughing sarcastically, saying that I was the girl who tricked him when he was drunk. Ha. They beat me into giving birth to a premature baby. When the baby was born, that woman rushed in to snatch the baby and tried to strangle it. Luckily, the 2 elders arrived in time to save the baby's life. I was chased away when I just gave birth. I have not seen my child's face once, only heard the kitchen girl say that it was a girl. After saying that, she laughed madly. Min said, I will do it in any way to get revenge, please help me. The old lady laughed devilishly and replied, if you want revenge, you must use my magic, ha ha ha, in exchange for the life of your other child, do you agree? I agree, ma'am. Okay, now lie down. I will take the baby out and take its blood. The old woman boiled a small pot of medicine, and in a few minutes the pot of medicine was boiling. She added many kinds of powder, unknown what kind of powder. The smell was strong and faintly rotten like a dead rat. When it was done, she took it off the stove and poured it into a bowl, telling Min to drink it all. Min held the bowl of medicine, closed her eyes and drank the whole bowl in one gulp. Only about 5 minutes later, Min's stomach was in pain. Something seemed to be kicking and scratching at Min's uterus. From below her lower body, blood flowed out and soaked her pants. The old woman laughed loudly, forcing Min to stand up, then took a bowl and sat down, pulling down Min's pants to catch that blood. Enduring the pain, something just slipped out of Min's crotch. A red, bloody lump was a fetus leaning into the shape of a human. The fetus slipped out, Min held her stomach and lay flat on the ground. The old woman gave Min a bowl of medicine and said it would stop the bleeding. Min took it, drank it all, and tiredly closed his eyes. After the old woman had collected the blood and the fetus in a bowl, she brought it to the altar. On it were scattered eggs, blood, hair, and a clay figure that looked like a sleeping child. She cut the blood from her hand and mixed it with the blood of the bowl containing the premature baby. She sat and chanted a magic spell. The bowl with blood seemed to be boiling. The blood in the bowl gurgled and gurgled out. When she finished chanting the magic spell, she stopped the blood and poured it onto the clay figure. Wherever the blood poured, the clay figure of the sleeping child was absorbed. As for the fetus, she used a knife to cut it into 3 bowls, one for the head, one for the body, and one for the limbs. She pounded the bowl containing the head with a pestle until it was a bowl of slimy flesh. Then she smeared it on the head of the statue, then the bowl containing the body, the bowl containing the limbs were all pounded into a smooth paste. Covering the clay statue, the layer of blood and flesh that was fresh and put on the statue seemed to come to life. When the sculpting was finished, the old woman cut Min's hand to get some blood, then told Min to get up, take a knife and cut the blood from the heart to let it flow into the next bowl, then cut off both ends of her nipples and put them in a few bowls. Min gritted his teeth in pain and followed, accepting all physical pain to get revenge with magic. Holding the bowl of blood, the heart and nipples, he gave it to the old woman. She held the bowl of blood, her cloudy eyes emitting a green light, took the rotten flesh from the statue and mixed it into the bowl, then said, take this bowl home. When you cook rice, feed him a little every day. It only takes 7 days for your revenge to be avenged. Those who harmed you will all be avenged, and now, after drinking this bowl of my magic medicine, you will be as strong as a buffalo, you will be as beautiful as a fairy. I will have to kneel at your feet to serve you. Drink it. Min held the bowl of magic medicine and drank it all. When it reached her stomach, her whole body was burning hot from her stomach to the top of her head, and then spread throughout her body. That heat was like a fire burning her heart and 6 organs. After the burning was a cool, numbing feeling. Min felt suddenly healthy and full of vitality. Her honey-brown skin transformed into a white skin like a peeled egg. Her pink lips were red like a mulberry. I don't understand what that medicine was that made people change their skin so much. The old woman looked at Min and nodded. Go all the way down this river, turn past 2 deserted graves, and you will reach Tamha village. Remember from tomorrow onwards to feed me the meat in this bowl every day. 7 days, exactly 7 days. Min held the bowl of meat, kowtowed. After you've paid your revenge, I will come back to repay your kindness. The old woman laughed heartily. If you can get your revenge, then I will be satisfied. Go away, never come back here. The old woman chased Min away. Min walked as if running on the edge of the river, passing 2 deserted graves. Hidden before her eyes were hungry ghosts screaming loudly. Min said nothing, holding the bowl tightly, and continued walking. Passing 2 deserted graves in front of her was the gate of Tamha village. Min went straight into the village to Old Fu's house. At that time, the sky was bright, the sun was near the top of the pole. Min went into the room where the old man lay, smiling charmingly. Wake up, I'm home. I'm sorry for staying at the teacher's house last night without telling you. Old Fu opened his eyes and closed his eyes. Seeing Min made his mind go crazy. Oh my God, it's only been 1 night. Why is this girl so beautiful as a fairy in a painting? The old man sat up, reached out to hug Min, groping and kissing her. Since taking the magic medicine, Min seemed to have transformed, washing away everything in her head that was filled with resentment, lying down for old Fu to beat on. As soon as he finished his work, Min asked to go down to the kitchen to cook rice. The old man nodded happily and satisfied. When the rice was cooked, Min took a piece of meat and put it in the pot of braised meat and brought it up. After struggling for a while, old Fu was so hungry that he pounced on the rice and ate the braised meat and all that meat. Old Fu was hugging Min and sleeping soundly when he suddenly woke up because of a stomachache. His stomach was in constant pain. The pain made him sweat profusely. Min turned to rub his stomach, and the old man suddenly stopped feeling pain. After that, he had a craving and climbed on Min enthusiastically. After several bouts of enthusiasm, his limbs were so sore and tired that he couldn't stop. He pushed and thrusted until his back was about to break, but he couldn't stop until the rooster crowed loudly, and he fell down to rest. The next morning, Min fed him meat again, for 7 consecutive days. Every night he ate meat, there was a change in the old man's family. At Liu's husband's house, there was a change. Liu's belly was big, and she was lying down being massaged by the maid. Her husband, too, was busy working elsewhere, and while working he was getting another girl pregnant. Kan Lu was pregnant, and could not serve the lustful Tu enough, so every night Tu went out to find some geishas to have fun until the next day. Kan Lu here liked her husband's son Tu, a tall, handsome man with a strong body. Kan Lu, with her lustful nature, had only been at her husband's house for a month, and had already seduced Kan Lu. These two took advantage of the opportunity to get close to each other when everyone went to sleep. The maid had her feet pounded until almost night, and she put her to bed, waiting for her lover to come. Nearly an hour later, Kan Lu crawled into the room. While she was enjoying herself, Kan Lu suddenly screamed in pain. Her belly was rolling up and down, the baby inside was kicking wildly, wanting to burst through her belly. Kan Lu's screams echoed throughout the house. Kan Lu was scared and pulled up his pants and ran away. The teacher went to her husband's house and called the midwife. After 2 hours of struggling and screaming, Kan Lu gave birth to a child. The midwife had just received the child in Liu's womb when she suddenly screamed, "Ah! Monster, oh monster!" The midwife kicked the door open and rushed in to see. Everyone looked at the baby the midwife was holding in her arms and fell backwards. A baby without private parts. It had 2 heads, 3 arms for legs, kicking and thrashing around. That thing was a pair of deformed conjoined twins. The 2 heads had 2 eyes that were blinking strangely. The 2 mouths were screaming and crying loudly. Everyone saw that and ran out in panic, leaving the mother and child behind. The monster kept screaming and screaming. Its cries were tearing and piercing people's eardrums. Lu, who had lost blood and fainted, was awakened by the crying. She picked up her child and tried to breastfeed him. The flickering light of the oil lamp made her unable to see the child clearly. With her maternal instinct, Lu opened her breast to breastfeed him, but why? This child was sucking so painfully that it felt like it wanted to swallow human flesh. Lu couldn't pull away, but the child was biting her flesh. Lu pulled so hard that a piece of her breast flew out. Lu threw the child to the ground, screaming and running away into the night. Old Fu's stomach was swollen like a pregnant woman's, bigger than a basket. He ate 3 pots of rice every meal like a reincarnated hungry ghost. All day and all night he called the servants to serve him food. His limbs were skinny, and his belly was so big that he couldn't even walk. He now looked no different from a hungry ghost in legends. The 3rd wife saw that he was sick and about to die, so she took all the money and property in the house and ran away with a servant. Every day Min fed him, sometimes even mixed raw meat in for him. But he kept opening his mouth and swallowing without chewing. Old Fu's teeth were naturally sharp and unusual. He asked for raw chicken and live dog many times. Min laughed and bought 2 roosters and put them in the room. When he saw the roosters, he happily screamed and reached out to catch one. He opened his mouth and used his sharp, jagged teeth to bite off the chicken's head. The old man chewed the chicken's head, crackling like chewing coconut meat, the blood of the chicken spurted out. He opened his mouth tightly and sucked the blood from the severed neck, swallowing it greedily. He ate 1 chicken after another. When he was full, he closed his eyes and went to sleep. His only son was studying in the province. He didn't know which official's daughter he teased, but he was beaten to death and thrown in the street corner. On Saturday night, when Min gave him the last piece of meat, the rich old man seemed to have lost all humanity. He needed to see blood and raw meat to go crazy and howl with joy. In the afternoon, Min had just brought him a dog so that after he finished eating, he could go back to his room to rest, lying in his room rearranging everything, feeling satisfied because he was about to succeed. Somehow, the half-crazy Lu ran from her husband's house in the province here. She wandered around the yard, then turned into Mr. Fu's room and sat next to him, laughing wickedly. The old man was sleeping when he suddenly smelled the smell of raw meat. He opened his eyes wide, bared his fangs, and reached out to grab Lu's neck and bite and suck its blood. Lu's neck was bitten off, and blood flowed profusely, but she still laughed happily. Old Fu was a cannibal demon. He bit and swallowed the flesh on Lu's body and face, chewing and chewing. Lu lost too much blood and died. Meanwhile, the old man was chewing on its flesh and gnawing on its bones, sticking his hand into its stomach, digging out its intestines and eating them ravenously. Under the warehouse, the eldest wife was sleeping in the barn. Suddenly she felt a chill down her spine. Her teeth were chattering. The eldest wife woke up, wrapped herself in a thin blanket, her body trembling, intending to call the servant to bring her a blanket. However, the eldest wife opened her mouth to call her, but no sound came out. It just grunted like a mute dog. She reached out to turn on the oil lamp to light up, and saw a shadow sitting in the corner of the wall facing the wall. She thought it was a thief opening his mouth to call someone, but no sound came out. The eldest wife took a risk, grabbed a wooden chair in her hand, and hit the shadow's head with a fatal blow, with a bang. The shadow still sat still, then it gradually turned around and opened its eyes to look. Looking closely, it turned out that the shadow had the body of an adult and the head of a newborn baby. It looked like the illegitimate child of Lu and Mr. Fu. It looked at her and smiled, then it jumped down, and in return the other body was Mr. Tao. These two black, demonic shadows gradually and slowly approached the old lady. She screamed in fear and struggled, knocking the oil lamp down onto the pile of straw. The fire flared up and engulfed the evil woman. The servants saw the fire and did not go in to put it out, but stood there watching. Without anyone telling them, they went into the house to find something valuable and fought to grab it and run away. Ms. Min went into the house, grabbed the oil lamps and threw them down on the ground. The fire caught the oil, caught the cloth, and burned the wood, burning brightly. The big fire burned the old lady alive, burned alive the monster in human form, Mr. Fu. The fire swallowed all the property that his family had robbed from the poor for generations. The fire swallowed everything. In the midst of the raging sea of fire, many shimmering figures gradually appeared, and they gathered together and stood in the middle of the yard. Their figures were vague in their dark eyes. Their facial features were unclear. Those were people who died unjustly, died at the hands of this family, including the souls of Tam, Mrs. Hai, An Tao, the newborn baby. Ms. Min stood in the middle of the yard, laughing loudly, then her clear voice sang a exam song. There was a rich man who harmed his husband and stole his wife. There was Mrs. C.A.'s son who strangled his nephew to death. There was a willow child who soiled their whole bodies. The whole family was immoral. Many ghosts returned for revenge. They all came back for revenge. Your family was evil, their descendants were cut off. They would pay for their karma for generations. How much wealth did Ms. Min actually take from the second day and night? She hid it all. In 3 boxes in the pig pen. That night, the fire burned down the rich man's house, leaving nothing behind. People saw the fire burning high into the sky and rushed to watch. They gossiped and pointed. Many people even laughed happily. Ms. Min told them to line up and gave each person some gold coins and said, "Whose land is being rented from old Fu? From now on it will belong to everyone. The money they robbed from us for so many years, I will return it. From now on we are free." Everyone cheered in joy. Ms. Min kept a bag of gold coins and brought it back to the priest to thank him for raising the children. Then she took her 3 children and took the bamboo card back to her house. Back to where everything had not started. Back to a life of poverty but joy and happiness. The house was in ruins. She looked at it with tears streaming down her face. She rebuilt the bamboo table and placed on it the bamboo card engraved with her husband's name. Ms. Min stood there and clasped her hands and prayed, "O priest, we have returned to our home. I have avenged my priest. Please forgive my father. My father blesses my father and children, remember." After praying to her husband, she went out to the yard to call her children back. The sky was still sunny. The wind was still gentle. Look up to the sky and breathe in the smell of freedom. The end.